Aftab and I want to take as little time as possible to get to the discussion, but we do want to indicate a few things that will form that discussion. And I want to say that I was first introduced to Aftab during the John Montgomery's session on the Great Transformation and getting to a net zero world. And I think that and a couple of the sessions that we've had on the interdevelopment goals, which is what we're going to focus on in this session, and finding out that Aftab was involved in that in a pretty intimate way, relating to all the things that he's done in the past, made me think that this would be a perfect session, because I was so impressed by the comments that he made about the topics of the session on transformational learning, on culture and complexity, and conflict, and developmental asymmetry, which I think is a really fascinating subject, and also bringing in the topic of vertical learning, which Michael Putz has been bringing into our sessions, and I think is so important, that I realized that this was going to be a real opportunity. And I want to introduce a film that I think almost everybody here has seen before, but just as an introduction to the interdevelopment goals. I'm doing this instead of the more careful introduction that Mary Gelinas and Marilee Adams did to the interdevelopment goals and the UN's sustainable development goals. But I just want to get a sense of that before we get into the discussion with Aftab. So Jessica, could you show us that film? We don't have sound. Jessica, we don't have sound.
The inner development goals show what inner shifts or human growth needs to happen.
Could we start again then? We start at the beginning with the sound?
The inner development goals show what inner shifts or human growth needs to happen in order for us to increase our chances of reaching the sustainable development goals collectively.
The inner development goals covers 23 skills that are divided into 5 categories. Skills such as inner compass, openness and learning mindset, self-awareness, presence, sense-making, connectedness, humility, co-creation skills, trust, and perseverance.
What I see as the basic human challenge, when we talk about mind shift, when we talk about growth that matters, I think the basic human challenge is this. It is difficult to learn if you already know.
We see a lot of leadership failure, leaders being out of touch with reality. So in other words, it's a lack of listening. So listening, I believe, is not just an important one, it's the most important and most underrated leadership skill today.
Obviously, being flexible, being able to be agile, being able to listen, and be able to be very inclusive in terms of how you lead people. I think those are some things that I've learned over the time.
We are built to grow. It is our destiny to grow. A caterpillar is not supposed to die as a caterpillar. Its destiny is to grow wings and fly.
We need to sort of focus more inwards, and what is my responsibility in that? What can I contribute to a development that is more sustainable? But in order to be able to reach those sustainability goals, we need to also be able to take the right decisions to get there.
And I think where we are today, perhaps, is we've hit a limit to purely technocratic external solutions to solve global problems. Mental health and well-being is supported by our inner capacities for spirituality and faith, where education is fundamentally oriented towards meaning and purpose in a changing world, rather than mere content delivery for students.
Being human has many dimensions, and that the dimension that we have been very good at exploring during the last couple of 100 years has been the external world, but that we have come to a point where the outside perspective has to be complemented by an inside perspective.
Teaching a course like Global Challenges at Stockholm School of Economics, I realize more and more that we cannot reach the sustainability goals if we do not work with our inner development. This does not apply only to universities. This applies to all sectors, all ages.
What we really need is a deliberately developmental society. And depending on how severe you think the situation is, maybe we need a deliberately developmental world. And right now, we're not even talking about at scale the inner dimensions and how we need to change. Because at the core, we are the problem. The way that we're acting in the world, the way that we are solving problems is the problem.
I used to think the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that with 30 years of good science, we could address those problems. But I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with those, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation.
Any sustainable development goal, that's essentially our generation's big, ambitious vision for the world. In our experience, when we work with individuals, both within and outside Oxford, people are more likely to take action when these inspiring visions are brought down to their level.
We bring now the inner development goals with us as a great source of inspiration when we strengthen and revise our competence development roadmaps and make sure that the inner development goals are integrated into this.
And as Einstein said, we are never going to be able to solve our problems with the same order of consciousness that created these problems. So as a species, we need more and more of us to grow and develop so that we have actually a bigger purchase on, a bigger perspective on, a bigger ability to solve the biggest, most dangerous kinds of challenges that we face.
To make the world work better requires highly specialized skills, very useful, but quite high level skills. And so what we want to say to people is, yes, it's great that you want to help make the world work better, but you have to get into training.
Thank you. Thank you, Jessica. I have a lot of reactions when I see that, and that happened earlier this year or maybe late last year. Somebody has their should go on mute. Thank you. And you can see how Aftab, at least I can, Aftab is a perfect person to lead off our discussion about this. And I wanted to ask Aftab about your organization. You're the president, CEO, founder of Meridian University. And can you tell us a little bit about that with regard to, I guess in regard to the inner development goals and what that means for learning in business, because it's an example of something that could be placed right in line with the inner development goals initiative.
I can, and thank you, Michael and Elaine, for connecting us with our innerness at the onset. So Meridian University is about 30 years old, very young for a university. And if we just reflect on what has happened between 1992 and today, these last 30 years, it becomes very clear because an initiative conceived at one of the California State University campuses, pre-internet, the World Wide Web, has a certain frame to it. And then the digital revolution occurs. So, however, there is some continuity here. There's significant continuity, and that is embodied in the name Meridian, because it was selected. The basis for its selection was that the term meridian evokes how we humans imaginatively construct our relationship to Earth. That the meridian lines are imaginary. They are a human construct in relation to Earth, and that our relationship, the human relationship to the Earth as a whole, and we as Earthlings, has to be primary in shall we say, a renewed vision of education that does not put content delivery, as the phrase was used in the film, does not put content delivery as primary. So then, Michael, applying that to business, as you know from all your years at a business school, that content has its own seductive and compelling dynamic as it evolves, and that content-based expertise is very highly valued and very highly compensated. However, there's something else that this present gathering needs no advocacy or explanation about. There's something else that determines what the impact of expertise, including business expertise and any of the core business functions that we teach at business school, that what actually happens when we implement that expertise is related to something that remains fundamentally mysterious. And we can refer to that as innerness, or that's one way we can refer to that mysterious underpinning for how expertise, including business expertise, actually impacts both the present and the future.
And so the basis of this is transformative learning.
This is true, that if we are going to connect the informational basis, the informational competencies that go with informational learning, content-based, content expertise-focused learning, that we need another kind of learning that interacts with informational learning, integrates with informational learning, if that informational learning is going to be applied in ways that serve us collectively, and otherwise more narrowed interests become the focus, and the costs get externalized, and we know the results, which is why we are gathered here today.
That's right. Yeah. And that's kind of what they were talking about in this little film, and what the whole Interdevelopment Goals project is all about. Can you talk a little bit about how you got to this point of founding Meridian? And I mentioned in the announcement of this that you have this background of starting as a I said a Muslim youngster raised in all these different places and then ending up at MIT and Harvard and then Brandeis and getting to this particular point of view, because in a sense, you could have gone into a really, like a training-based education, and not being transformative. So how did this happen for you?
Good luck. Being blessed in all kinds of emergent ways. The first thing that came to my mind, Michael, when you began to go in this direction was witnessing poverty. The combination of being well cared for in my middle-class family by educated parents. My father had co-founded a university. My mother worked for the United Nations. That blessing juxtaposed with being around intense poverty, literally right outside our home, and on my way to school, all through my schooling years in the various cities I grew up in, had very much an effect that in retrospect, my sense is that my instinct for interdisciplinarity, for transdisciplinarity, is problem focused, meaning that the question of relevance and the question of impact very much was with me experientially. And even though my formal education very much was science and math driven, because that's schooling. I went to most of my years was at a school run by the Navy. But my cultural environment, not being modern in so many ways, being traditional, kept me early on from not being narrowed in my understanding of education. And I think that was a great blessing.
It's wonderful. I'd like to just focus finally on the title of this session and those aspects of it. And so in any order you want, but transformational learning and culture, complexity, diversity, and those things. So can we talk a little bit about each of those before we go into a general thing? Because I think the depth of your understanding of those, and I think it'll come out in the discussion too with others here, but I'd just like to ask you to talk about each of those.
Michael, I'll begin with one of my favorite two lines from the Austrian poet Rainer Maria Rilke, which many of us are likely to be familiar with. Just in case you're not, the last name is R-I-L-K-E, Rilke, or some people say Rilke. And so here's the line, which goes like this. He says, not to be cut off, not even through the slightest partition from the law of the stars, from the law of the stars. The inner, what is it, if not intensified sky? The inner, what is it, if not intensified sky? Hurled through with birds and deep with the winds of homecoming. So what has drawn us into this call today is likely that first word, inner, and all the reverberations and resonances that has for the people who are here today. And then most of us are very aware of the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN articulated, 17 of them. And only about 4 of them have intimations of, or let's say direct intimations of innerness. And so I would guess many of us noticed that, given our backgrounds, many of us noticed that when we first saw the SDGs, as this is important. It's a good step for the United Nations. It's a good step in terms of the consensus that, or relatively speaking, the consensus that was helped to enable the SDGs to be adopted, and the dimension of innerness, the reality of innerness, we should perhaps say the primacy of innerness is missing in the SDGs. So this was the inspiration, the prompt, the provocation, the imperative that that converged about 20 of us to gather 3.5 years ago on this island off the coast of Stockholm in the archipelago, to begin, shall we say, what is the other leg necessary to have 2 legs to move forward in terms of our aspirations for the future? That the SDGs, while easier to get alignment around, had left something out, implied, but that needed to be explicit because it would require explicit collective will and explicit and highly scaled collaboration, and that we actually didn't know how to do that, and we still don't know how to do that. And I am seeing you nod, John, and I'm starting to think about our recent conversation in this group about your work. So I hope you'll jump in with some of that, and we can establish some continuities with where you went in your presentation 2 or 3 months ago. So if we recognize that along with outer development, there is inner development, and that inner development is more mysterious to be able to speak about. And even though the cultural issues that go with outer development and with how we're going to go about scaling the SDGs, the cultural issues are very present even there. The World Bank has been criticized intensely for how development, when that term's been used to just mean outer development, has then been implemented, how it's been thought about, and how local differences, societal and cultural differences, have not been sufficiently kept in mind in how we understand what sustainable goals would mean in Rwanda. So once we then bring in inner development, then the cultural challenge gets even deeper. And that means we need to understand how development is promoted. Is there a way to promote development, both individual and collective? And what is the connection between individual inner development and individual collective development, which brings us to the primacy of culture. So then we can ask the question, surely this agenda of fostering individual inner development and collective inner development couldn't be new. We as a species have arrived here after 200,000 years of leaving Africa, East Africa. And we've arrived here 10,000 years after agriculture and 5,000 years after writing. There's a collective process of not just technological development, not just developments in social structure or civilizational developments. There is a collective process of cultural development or inner collective development. And surely we have collectively as a species learned something about it. And where is that knowledge? For many of us, I know in terms of present company, that knowledge is actually in the spiritual traditions with the focus on consciousness. And different cultures have been shaped in different ways by practices that we would now call spiritual practices. But we, in modernity, made it a point, in fact, made it a defining point to keep that outside of education. Because modernity, especially in the shape of universities, was about secularity, and that anything that would evoke the terms spirituality, sacrality, religion, God forbid, had to be kept out of education per se, and particularly higher education, and that faith-based education, faith-based educational institutions, universities, are given some wiggle room on it by accreditors. But otherwise, this separation has been required, has been mandatory, and it is not recent. It goes with how modernity came to understand education. So then it has been necessary to actually find a way to make a place for inner development, not just content delivery, but inner development within higher education. And that effort has come to be known as transformative learning. So Meridian set out 30 years ago with that express intent of integrating transformative learning and informational learning, because even in higher education, transformative learning has a very, very tentative footing, barely a beachhead. I should pause here, Michael. I think this is one of my favorite topics. So
I know.
I'm going to have to remind myself to be concise.
Okay, no, that's wonderful. And so I'm glad we got to that point, but we've got a lot of people here, and I would welcome comments and insights, and especially about the inner development goals and that whole project, and what it means. Can it be done? What the implications are, some of which Aftab just spoke about. So we'll open up there. What's burning inside you in terms of this? Or maybe tickling you, I don't know.
Aftab, it's Bill Vogelkasong. I'm curious how transformative learning manifests itself in your curriculum.
Bill, I'm trying to find you on the screen. There you are. Okay, you're off video. So what this entails, hello, Bill. What this entails is a whole set of other competencies. So the word goals is slippery. It brings value, but it also brings fallacies. But if we begin to differentiate competencies into different kinds of competencies, skills, capacities, capabilities, qualities, values, we begin to see that there's a whole set of other competencies. We might say a whole set of another ecology of competencies that actually isn't tied into informational learning, isn't tied into content expertise. It's tied to this other dimension, the inner dimension. And so what are those competencies, qualities, capacities, capabilities? Then we really begin to ask ourselves, well, what deeply, deeply matters in terms of who a person is and how an organization or a community or a society or a nation keeps its coherence. Is courage important in this culture? Is courage a competency? Is compassion important? Is clarity important? Is dignity important? And then we just go from there. And we begin to see that we would need a term like virtues to be able to hold the immensity of this ancient set of commitments that we could call virtues that make us human, and to exile that from our educational discourse, because that's how modernity came to be, and bring in what it brings, which has also been very valuable, and the constraints that modernity put on the exploitative, oppressive, violent enactments in the name of religion were also important. So that's where I went, Bill, in terms of what, if transformative learning is part of the intent, and if transformative learning is how we can, in an intentional, formal way, foster inner development, both individual and collective, then we would begin with, so what are the competencies that matter? And do virtues have a place in that ecology of competencies? Back to you, Bill, if you'd like to follow up with that.
So give me maybe one practical example pick a course, and how sort of give me one snippet of how transformative learning is brought into something I might understand.
I'll go with courage, Bill. It's a virtue that is almost never controversial. It is sometimes confused with bravery or boldness. But if we take courage to mean the willingness and the ability to act in the presence of danger and fear, both danger and fear, not in the absence of fear, but in the presence of both danger and fear, what a difference that makes, we don't need to speak to. But how is courage developed intentionally, formally? Because we develop courage and life brings us into experiences, but how can we do that? And so just a very, I would say, overly simple example, Bill, would be the popularity of ropes courses. Ropes courses are effective in a certain range of reigniting, renewing a person's relationship or a team's relationship to risk, danger, fear. But then inside a classroom, an on-site classroom or a Zoom classroom now in the last almost 3 or 2.5 years, there's a whole set of other practices that need to come in terms of how we shift our relationship to risk and danger, how we shift our relationship to the interpersonal risk without which necessary conversations don't happen, without the necessary conflict that has to be undergone, given the risk, given the danger, given what is at stake. So, for example, we could ground it even further. Bill, thank you for the turn towards more groundedness. We could raise the level of risk amongst us, even in the time we have together. We could raise the level of interpersonal risk intentionally and begin to expand the, shall we say, the horizons of innerness within which this conversation is constrained by some of our more, shall we say, more conventional habits of discourse that we bring to our Zoom conversations.
So I want to direct this a little bit. I'm just fascinated with the whole idea of the inner development goals. Does it really make sense? You know, is this something that can be done on this level? And I'm just interested in what all of you think. And I know some people are going to have to leave at 11. I hope a number of you can stay after that so we can keep going with this and you can see it on the recording. But what are your thoughts about the inner development goals? Carol.
Well, I'm not sure that this has anything to do with your question, but I'm really taken with in the film, the real problem is selfishness, greed, and apathy.
Yes.
That really hits home. And given that we are like that, and that, well, my question is, can we develop an economic system, given who we are, that doesn't require or doesn't depend on increasing consumption?
You know,
Anybody know?
Yeah, no, I do. I have an answer to that, actually.
Oh, you do? Oh, wow, yay.
Yes. Part of it is the work that John Montgomery presented a couple times ago. I don't know if you were here for that. I don't think you were. The other one is that, and this is just a general thing, but there's this book called Ministry for the Future. And it indicates, it's kind of a handbook for how we deal with the environmental crisis. It's really interesting. And in that, they have a way of dealing with the economic system that's really, really incredible, because they develop a new type of currency that's tied to environmental action. And they get the World Bank and everybody to do this and change everything around to kind of wipe away everything that Jack Welch did to our economic system. And it's really great. So I recommend that book for a full answer to your question. But we'll go on from there. So Tom, thanks, Carol.
Yeah, thanks, Michael, and thanks, Aftab. A couple of thoughts I wanted to throw into the mix. So picking up on your comment, Carol, you know, the film talks about some of the negative attributes of humanity, and I would, you know, put forward, and we shared the Third Harmony film earlier this year. I would say that, you know, that's who we've become, but it's not who we are.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's really important to make that distinction. And what I love about what Aftab is sharing is, in some ways, it's about transforming back to who we really are, not transforming to something that we're not already hardwired, because we're hardwired for collaboration and cooperation. And so I wanted to throw that into the conversation and the mix. The second thing I wanted to share is that, you know, picking up on what John Montgomery shared in a couple of sessions ago, you know, as a species, and, you know, the Millennium Development Goals was a good start, around creating a sense of focus for the human species. And then the SDGs is a second milestone, but it still falls short because we really need regenerative development goals. And we really need to transform humanity. And my hope is that whatever replaces the SDGs in 8 years incorporates the interdevelopment goal piece. And as Aftab mentioned, its primacy is the inner piece, not be secondary to the external. And the last piece I'll throw into the mix is that I've been socializing this idea with many of you on the screen about the Guild taking on an initiative next year to create some kind of transformational personal development, conscious leadership development, whatever we want to call it, but introducing a self-assessment tool for each of us and a development path. And Aftab and I had a chance to talk yesterday about some of his thinking and work. John Montgomery and I have had conversations. Michael Putz and I have had conversations, and Janet and I have had conversations. My hope is that in 2023, as a guild, we're able to do some work on what does that look like for the guild? What are the resources? What are the tools? To Bill's question, how do we practically introduce something that helps each of us in our personal transformation? And I love what you've curated this year, Michael, with these conversations, because it's really helped build some momentum around creating something for all of us next year. And so I'll be reaching out or continue to reach out to people to see if we can get something going in 2023. And certainly all of you on the screen and anybody else in the guild that wants to come play, I'm excited about moving this forward.
Thanks, Tom. Ilan.
Thank you, Aftab. I was wondering, since you participated in the elaboration of the inner development goal, there is a group of them, the third set, called Relating, Caring for Others and the World, that seem to be most diametrically opposed to the growth for growth's sake, etc. So I was wondering, both, I don't know if it was one of the most difficult one to surface, especially if it's not just connection to others, but to the world, nature, etc. And how do you deal with that in the Meridian curriculum in a way that would overcome that I would say that discrepancy or that polarity between the dominant worldview, which is not that at all, and the kinship worldview that has been used, especially as an alternative to indigenous worldview?
Thank you for that question, Elaine. And I'd love to take an hour with you one-on-one. It's been a long time since we've spoken one-on-one, because there's so much there in that question.
Let's start a retreat right now. Go for the whole weekend.
Yeah, I think, Elaine, you just brought us into the heart of the matter, and that any understanding of innerness would have its origin in how we understand what the heart is beyond its nature as a pump to drive blood. And clearly we know from both indigenous cultural codes, traditional cultural codes, both, that there is a thread of heart mysteries that hold us together when we hold together. And when we don't, it's heart woundedness individually and collectively. So all of that has gotten more attention now in terms of under the phrase developmental trauma. meaning what are the events and conditions that stagnate or thwart individual and collective development. So I hope, Elaine, that at a minimum, you and I will find an hour together soon.
We will. Thank you.
Don?
I'd love to be a fly on the wall for that.
That's right. Let's make it another session, just hearing the two of you talk about it.
Well, thanks, Aftab, for your work on this and other people who are working on the inner development goals. I want to come back to something that actually Tom Eddington alluded to, which is, there's sort of these two different personalities we have, and almost like two different brains, two different ways of working. And I'm curious, as you work on these topics of the IDG, I've been finding that it's actually sometimes easier to get people to change the processes that they use, in other words, change behavior, than it is to change their thinking. No one wants to have somebody else change their thinking, but they're willing to try something different if it's open and easy and, engaging. So I'm wondering, how are you working on the what do you think about that observation, and how are you working on the sort of process end versus the kind of cognitive end of bringing the aspirations of these goals to fruition?
A lot there in that question too, Don. I'll be concise. A conceptual framework is a conceptual framework. And like any conceptual framework, if it's applied formulaically and ideologically, it quickly tips into more problematic than helpful. So all those risks are evident and implied in your question, I suspect. So the Inner Development Goals Initiative has just released a toolkit, and it is now on the website that can be downloaded. And this was the second phase of survey-based research. It has the limitations of survey-based research, but nevertheless, the 200 or so methods of transformative learning, shall we say, were reviewed and organized into a framework. So again, it's a second framework now having to do with methodology. How will we foster development, inner development? So that is where we are right now, Don.
Okay, does that also include, because my observation is the people who sign up for the training and development, like on emotional intelligence, are the people who are already inclined, but the people who really need it most don't show up. So is your toolkit also helping sort of with what I would call guerrilla techniques to introduce this, to people who might be resistant to a frontal address of these topics, and more of an oblique one would be more effective? And I'm curious, I don't know if I caught where I would find this toolkit that you're talking about. So maybe somebody can put that in the chat or whatever.
Minimally, Don. At this point, the whole challenge of developmental asymmetry is so complex and so full of interpersonal risk and intercultural tensions that it has not been taken on as a, shall we say, a challenge of practice. And how do we grow practitioners who have the necessary ecology of competencies to take on cultural differences and the developmental asymmetries that go simply by the existential reality of cultural difference and all kinds of other differences. So shall we say, the internationalization, the globalization of the framework has just begun with the third phase. A gathering in Rwanda has just been completed. And predictably, criticism is coming in about how Western, how cognitive, how Swedish the framework is, And our Swedish colleagues are holding steady in terms of what they've contributed, and are truly open to the cultural difference. But openness is just one of the competencies that are needed to engage the necessary conflicts that go with developmental asymmetries. And that just engaging conflict non-violently is itself an ecology of competencies.
Can you say a little bit more, Aftab, about developmental asymmetries? Because I think it's so important. And I know that when you spoke about this in one gathering, you talked about having a course that is not fear-based and conscious of where people were and things of that sort. But in terms of, we could look at the 5 competencies or inner development goals, and we could say some people are just at thinking and so on. Others are at collaborating, and others are at acting and so on. Could you speak about it in terms of that? Is that and I don't want to get you off of what you talked about in terms of the cultural differences that exist within the people trying to do this, because I think that's very important. But
so individuals and collectives develop under optimal conditions, and optimality includes difficulty. That's part of what optimizes development. So it's a very contextually driven phenomenon, individual and collective development. And that means uniqueness will unfold and complexity will unfold. And that complexity will be enfolded within the unique inner, outer reality and actuality. And the possibilities that go with that, what is true in the present context. So any meta-conceptual framework then comes at a cost for recognizing the particularities that go with development, and why development, even in optimal circumstances, looks very, very different and shows up with very different webs of competencies with how individuals and teams and societies show up and how. So, those of us who work with organizations are acutely and aware of it because we learned this painfully. Something really worked well in this organization, and we showed up for our next gig and stumbled. So,
Aftab, I want to just come back to that. Janet, did you have a question or comment? We're getting to the hour side, so I want to make sure that everybody who has a chance.
I raised my hand, then I lowered it, and then you asked me. So
Okay.
I will share that I have a knot in my stomach over some of this. So I really appreciate it and value it. And then some of it, I guess it's because this week I've been writing a paper that it disagrees with some of this. So I'm looking forward to sharing in the just in the sake of learning more. And because I'm talking about what is sourcing the thinking. Maybe that's Western way approach, but this and is it more of the industrial age or behavioralist approach when you talk about toolkits and competencies? I've just written a whole document on that about best practices, follow the hero, follow the expert. And so I guess where I'm coming from is a more of a Socratic method that helps build personal agency versus someone external showing me the way. And then speaking of external, though, when I looked at some of those competencies, I would start with, we are living systems nested in a living ecosystem. And so it's how do we as conscious beings not just do self-improvement for the sake of improving myself, but improving the state of my ecosystem. And oh, by the way, that will improve me. So I just look forward to sharing. It just, my stomach was in a knot and I was saying, oh, is that the hot soup I had? I don't think so. It's just, I have a different way of looking. So I'm really looking forward to more conversation and understanding this. You can see we could go for a long time. Thank you.
Thanks, Janet.
I was a buzzkill. I shut everything down.
To the contrary, Janet, I would say that was a receptive silence for having the expansion of the frame. You know,
I like the silences when somebody says something, and just so it can really, it speaks of real community, really, in a sense. Yeah. Shay.
I'd like to riff off of what you just contributed, Janet. In what I hear when we use terms like goals and development, it is all very much industrial age terminology. And the research and the conversations I've had in the regenerative space, it is much more, the terminology is just very different. And also in the realm of ontological coaching, it is all about looking at the phenomenon of being, which is one thing that you didn't mention, Aftab, but I know that I'm sure you're aware of it. And I myself have been in conversations working on not things that are developmental, but in terms more like coming up with new distinctions that we can just illuminate so people can look to cultivate that in themselves. It's more like what they do in the wisdom, one of the wisdom traditions that I've studied, which is Indian. And they have very different distinctions because they use very different language. And those distinctions, once you embody them, it changes who you are and how you relate and how you operate in the world. And so that's the level that I'm thinking at and conversing at. And so if others in the group, in this group, are interested in that, I'd love to be in those conversations.
Them's fighting words.
Not fighting, collaborating words.
Collaborative.
Collaborative creative, constructive seeing from many perspectives and allowing things to come together and do that, and then do this, and then do that again. I mean, that's.
I say that with admiration.
Oh, okay.
No, but it's really interesting. I mean, and also the general thing that Don brought up is very interesting. Like, do you get people to these points by getting them to behave in a positive way and having that experience and getting them to do more and so on? It's a sort of a theory of change, you know, and you know, and that kind of thing will happen in times of crisis. You know, we keep coming back to this thing that if people could see the climate disaster, as Tom Eddington talks about, as a war, then everybody would get involved in it and they'd have those experiences. You know, and when Kennedy said we're going to put a man on the moon in 10 years and then everything mobilized to do that, the experiences of a lot of people were just incredible about how everybody mobilized to do that, and all these companies and groups of people worked on it and everything else. And I remember a story that I can't remember the fellow's name, but he was involved in one of the projects on this, and then the moon landing happened. And after that, and they came back to the office and there was nothing going on. It was just like dead and everything else. And he said to his boss, what happened and so on. He said, and the guy pointed up to the moon that happened to be in the sky, and he said, that happened. And now, you know, nothing's happening. So the idea of how we get pulled to our greatest capacities and sense through behavior and through crisis and so on is one way of looking at this that Don has done some really great work on. But then there's what you were talking about, which is I don't want to go into what you said you're saying, but yeah. Michael.
Hello, Michael.
Yeah.
Aftab, I was very moved by your comments during John's presentation a few months ago. And I was thinking about the connection to the Great Transformation conversation that John had. And the Great Transformation, so there's UN development goals in a generic sense of, I would say, raising the level of all boats, you know, that's what you would do in a UN development goal process, you know, trying to think about population, country level, global standards, right? And then there's a specific challenge that I think John's work points out if we're trying to make a massive societal shift to do net zero, climate change, and in the entire systemic process. It's not just a technological process or a business process or a cultural process. It is an inner transformation. And I think in various venues, various people, including myself, all have been looking for, oh, this will be the forcing function that will bring people, people have talked about, those who are most eager, like I think Don said, there's the people who are already here on a call, right? They're already consuming this material, but there's the rest of the world that's not, right? I've been thinking about, well, the rest of the world's no different than us, but we've been turned on to this. And sometimes people get turned on to things by opportunity, or they get turned on to things by challenge. And the Great Transformation is both an opportunity and a hell of a challenge that could bring a lot of people into the process of making a major leap forward, you know, because a lot of education is trying to bring the averages up bit by bit by bit, and that's very important. But the Great Transformation is really a leap, right? It's a significant step function of change that we see in history once in a while. And to do that, we have to mix in this idea of raising the collective average, but also pushing the edge, pushing the envelope in a significant way forward, right? And, you know, what John spoke about in the Great Transformation, specifically coming back to this IDGs, he's talking about we need a massive transformation of systems level thinkers who actually also have heart. You know, we have a disassociation. We have people who have a heart often, and we don't have people who have the systems level capacity to hold the complexity of transforming a global energy system, a global economic system, coming up with new means of a non-consumption based, non-growth based economic model, and all these different things. And so there's a challenge of raising the average, right? And then there's a challenge of pushing myself, people on this call, the leading edge of people who are doing the IDG work, the people doing spiritual practice across the world, making a leap forward for those people too, right? So there's different kinds of goals and different kinds of transformations. And then the urgency of the great transformation is that it's time bound. We don't have a chance for glaciation here, right? This is not a glaciation process. And so what's sort of frustrating, I'll just say, I'll fare up front, it's a little frustrating, is that it's always there. Everyone knows about it, but we're not talking about it. It's like, I'm going, if we don't address that, we're going to be in trouble, because, you know, we don't have 50 years to figure this out. And specifically the great transformation, not just for us, the great transformation for us. And so I read the IDG reports when they came out, and I saw Bob Keegan in the reports, you know, in the video, which I really appreciated. And Bob talked about bigger minds, right, and bigger selves being necessary to meet the moment. And I know that the UN Development Goals had a footnote saying for future processes, we'll talk about vertical development. But it wasn't in the IDG report that I saw. Now, maybe things have been updated since I saw the material. But I know we talked about this a bit, but to get the kind of systems thinking they were going to transform this incredibly complex society in a way that's going to be beneficial for everybody and also do it in time, we need to really up the game. And vertical development is an absolute essential part of that process. So I wanted to hear how you and your work connect to those and what you see coming for the UN Development Goals in terms of finally bringing in vertical development into the process.
So first, Michael, shifting the focus from individual inner development to collective inner development. As important as inner development, individual inner development is. That's a challenge. And that means lots of collective inquiry ahead on how to do that better, faster, at larger scale. And that brings us right into the cultural transformation conversation that we waded into at after John's talk. But John positioned it during his presentation. The next thing that comes to mind, Michael, is shifting from the development of the inner to what we could call the loss of innerness. This focus on the development of the inner is a type of privilege. And it's a blessing, and it's good. However, the context is layered by the loss of innerness. So the necessity and the courage that is required to turn towards that necessity, to understand the immense collective scale of the loss of innerness, and how modernity structurally requires a loss of innerness as it brings in all its value, so that the layers of separation, both individually and collectively, are built in to modern life, and our various postmodern maneuvers are just maneuvers right now. They're not, there's effectively a need for a new cultural code that is beyond both modern and postmodern, which would have to draw substantially from indigenous and traditional cultural codes to have enough of the substance with which the layers of descent into separation that we go through, from detachment to distraction to disembodiment to depression to dissociation. That's a whole sequence of descent. And what we do on deep states of dissociation, especially when they're collective, is what is one way to understand how is it possible that Russia can do what it's doing as we sit here. How is it possible? There's the European Union, there's NATO, there's all the G20, G7, all the ways in which there were efforts to establish dialogue. But here we are.
Well, I think that's, I can't agree with you more about how the system is inbuilt for those things. And that modernism and postmodernism, it's not a bug, it's a feature. It is meant to strip away all of those inner faculties. It doesn't mean that individuals are trying to do that. It's the inevitable outcome of the system. And I can't agree with you more. It's not a personal issue. It's just that is what modernism will do. It disenchants the world. Postmodernism will deconstruct and destroy any sense of shared meaning and identity, because it has to, right? Because we have to, how to retrieve that's a different question. But I think that I think that's a really important thing. And I'm thinking like, well, and how do we start conversations in this guild, for example? With it, it's a known, right? It's a given, it's a foundational issue. And that what it calls us to do is to look at people who are, there's whole parts of this world who are, they're hoping and praying, like Ukraine is hoping and praying to become part of the modern world. That is their cultural objective. They want to become part of the European Union. They want to have a modern economy. They want to be separate from the Soviet Union sort of, industrial age fascist system. And they would just love to be part of Europe, right? So their aspiration is to become modern. But then there's people in this guild who are looking at the recovery of indigenous traditions, recovery of different knowledges, and realizing we need to have something that's postmodern to create that leading edge that's going to help solve the global scale great transformation. At the same time, we're trying to preserve indigenous cultures. We're trying to build an environment. We're trying to help countries who are in different developmental places. But I'm sort of circling back to us in the guild and the collective practice community we have. What's the leading edge for us here in this room? Our inner development goals, right? And our inner development goals are, we're not Ukraine trying to become modernists. We were sort of soaked in modernism and postmodernism, right? And we're a community of practice that can basically create this integration of all the human wisdom. It's 5,000, 10,000 years old, and bring it together with all of the best of all the Western and other traditions about knowledge creation, modernism, postmodernism, and bring together a new synthesis, right? That is necessary to be able to execute the great transformation. And so I'd like us to sort of bring in what you said. It was very profound about just the loss that has occurred, right? But that puts an extra burden on us in this room who have the privilege of the loss of the inner. We have the privilege of being on retreats and done our personal processes for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years of development, right? And we have this privilege, and that privilege, I think, has to be paid off with us taking ourselves as a collective to the next level, not just because it's fun or interesting or the next stage for me, it's because it's an essential part of serving the world, right? I think we can't serve the world in the moment of crisis if we don't have our own inner development goal and our own collective development as a guild or a community or whatever communities people are involved with. And I'd like to speak to what is that challenge for us, right? Because I know you can help speak to that's the complement to all the stuff that John was talking about from the energy transformation, right? The systems transformation. There's got to be an inner transformational goals for us, me, everybody here, right? What is that goal? When Tom Eddington talked about a curriculum for the guild, if it's a guild that's anything that's like a guild, right? It would be a guild where we're all learning our trade, our practice. And our inner development goals would be to develop that, the thing you so beautifully spoke about. I was wondering if you could say anything about what that might look like.
Amen, Michael. Amen. It's the comments that are coming in, from Janet, from Shay, and you, those three come to mind right away, have a trajectory, have a trajectory that is challenging the culture of modernity about what is spoken, and even more importantly, how it is spoken. Thank you.
Well, Aftab, it seems to me that what we're hinting at here is the current civilizational system has normalized disassociation. Disassociation from one's Buddha nature, Christ consciousness, divinity, and the Gaia, Earth, Mother, the biosphere, the universe, and so there's that's the norm, is to be connected to the heart, to be connected to Buddha nature, Christ consciousness, Gaia, and everything that we've created has normalized disassociation from the inner and the outer, and so what I'm excited about the synthesis of. I mean, I wish Dean Anderson were here, because he's the expert on transformations. But the great transformation to a net zero civilization, and ultimately a regenerative one, requires both a transformation of culture, which changes systems, and a transformation of mindset, which is the inner piece, which changes behavior, right? And it's there's 4 quadrants in Wilber's system, and you can't have a transformation if you're not simultaneously addressing all 4 of those quadrants. And so I'm curious as to how the IDGs are going to be integrated into the SDGs. I know we only have 4 minutes left. I've got to call it 11:30, but that's how are those? What's the vision for how those are going to be integrated?
As you can imagine, John, with creative tension, there isn't acrimony yet, but there are tensions along that axis right now. And each of the terms, inner development and goals, is bringing with it a set of fallacies. And so taking the word goals, primarily because the word goals is used in the SDGs, has that invitation of, hey, look, this goes with the SDGs. But as Janet began to point to, that term itself is a descent, can be a descent into the great dissociation of modernity. So really, we shall see. And like any initiative, some people who were there in phase 1, beginning 3.5 years ago, are not there now. So there's some but new energy comes in, and but I am comforted by the fact that the core has been able to sustain its openness to critical input. And that means everything.
I need to share that each of these conversations reminds me that whatever doorway we walk through from the external leads us to the core center truth, which is the same no matter where we start. And so I'd like to share my version of that in my personal growth and learning about what I call cultural change and diversity and ethnocentrism and all the rest. Is when I began the work, I thought it was all like international behavioral competence would be enough, cultural differences. And then I discovered I tried to apply that domestically, that if I'm that ethnocentric around the world, what about with everybody in the US? And then I realized cultural differences in behavior modification wasn't enough. It had to be much more personal. And to make a long story short, I finally learned that, wow, even with ignorance of all of our differences and our behavioral skills, it's possible in the first 15 seconds meeting somebody to feel the energy within myself and within the other and in the co-created space to either get enhanced or get depleted. So that reminded me that put the MBA aside for a minute, Michael, and all the rest of us, all the systemic and all the organizational and all the interpersonal behaviors, practices, policies, etc., are not enough until we do the inner work on the personal side. And when we can really feel and hear one another and listen, it's the only way we learn, not when we're speaking. With the consciousness and the enhanced energy of connecting more at the soul level for people who can stand that language, that enhances our ability to improve our interpersonal and thereby our organizational and thereby our systemic. But without the personal, as has been said over and over, without the inner, there is no way to have integration of and oneness with all of our diversity and to have a common goal. But if our goal is common, then our differences help us achieve that, if to the extent that we can hear, feel, and enhance one another's growing consciousness. That's all.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Louis. And I'm wondering, Michael, if in the spirit of what Louis just said, we might close by hearing from everyone who's still here briefly about how they're affected at this time by where we are in our conversational field.
I think that's good. Yes.
Maybe John should check out first, since he said he has to leave at 11:30. I've got a soft close.
Well, I have a call at 11:30 with Peter Howard. So Peter messaged me in the chat saying we can linger a little longer if so.
So you and Peter could check out last then.
Yeah. So Peter and I will have the last word. Yeah. But I'm happy to go. I mean, as a retired lawyer or a graduated lawyer, I'm never short of words. So, but I thought I encouraged Michael Putz in the chat to ask Tom for the recording of this call so we could make a transcript, because I think there's been some really beautiful riffing on the IDGs, and both from a meta level, sort of on the great transformation, how do we get civilization, and the combination of inner and outer development, but also as all of this applies to the guild as modeling as being a holon or fractal of the greater collective. How do we, if Bob Keegan in the video says we need to have a developmental civilization, how do we model a developmental guild, right? That's collectively on its developmental edge and creates the container and the space for all of the members to be at their developmental edge. And within that container, there's inherent asymmetry, right? And so it's how do we collectively practice meeting everybody where they are and where the collective is, and so on and so forth. So I think this has been a really marvelous session, and I want to, just tip my hat to EASIG, because what I'm really seeing is that there's great cross-pollination with these conversations that they're riffing on prior conversations, they're adding to them. So there's magic happening here. So it's really, bravo.
So I don't want to cold call on anybody, but Myron, Craig, or Sam, Peter, I guess, would be in that category.
Yeah.
How do you like being in a category, Peter?
Give me a label. Any label will do.
Okay.
Louis Vuitton.
There you go. I'm a relatively newbie in these conversations. I'm struck by the synchronicities of I was just on the phone with Myron. That conversation built to this one, and I'm thinking about the trouble and the word guild. And I personally, as someone who's relatively new on the consciousness path, can't think of a better objective than what John just laid out. The purpose of the guild is to get all of us to our developmental edges. Because I certainly know that I don't know how to tell other people to become conscious. Right now, my work is about me. And I really appreciate the conversations and the spirit of generosity within this community to provide that and create that space. So thanks to everybody.
Thank you, Peter.
I would just say that I'm very grateful to be part of this conversation. I may have mentioned before, I am co-developing a new learning module for elders about that very subject. Is that how do we embody regenerative values and worldviews so that we change who we are and what we do in the world? So, and I can see that indeed it would be a logical, very desirable step for the Guild to have that conversation about inner development goals. And I know the words are difficult to use, but as you said, Aftab, some level of challenge is absolutely necessary for this to happen. So thank you, and I'll be part of the next steps for sure.
So thank you for all of those who thought about this conversation even before it happened, who were thoughtful enough to create the conditions for it happening, to inviting the space for it, holding the space, and for the conversation itself. Very important. And for me, how I engaged in this conversation is to listen to the complexity, the what may at times feel like contradictions, but to just be in the complexity for a reason. It, on one level, it's intellectually entertaining for one thing, and I can hang in there with my part in the variety. But the other is much more pragmatic, is to listen for the resources that are here. What's here? What's available? And that next step of, yes, being in conversation about it and talking about it, which is cross-pollinating and interesting and stimulating, to jump from how can we to are we? And that's the leap that usually slows everything down, because it's not actually a leap for those science-based, and my whole approach is science-based. I don't always use the terminology, and in fact, I rarely, but I'll use one here that's punctuated equilibrium. What may look like a leap is actually something that occurs over time that we don't necessarily notice until it happens. And yes, some things do happen quickly. But this opportunity of are we is what I'm fascinated with. And what happens in holding the complexity, I'm learning, it's not an answer, but by holding the complexity just as it is, what emerges is radical simplicity. If I don't hold the complexity, then the radical simplicity does not emerge. Even if it's there, I'm just not there because I'm somewhere else with whatever is important to me that I have to get in there that I'm attached to. That's all part of it. There's nothing wrong with that. And so I'm holding this. What are the resources? What are available? What is the are we? We are we aren't? What are we generating from the resources that and I consider the Guild to be an embarrassment of resources. What's actually happening? And so the final piece is, so the point to me, there's no we without I. It just doesn't work that way. So what am I moved to actually contribute to, no matter how small, that will make an actual difference for me? And how am I also looking for the opportunity to be a part of the larger we, as each of the I's are looking at, am I, and we get to are we making a difference? So that's where I'm at. Gratitude, no, it's just full gratitude with what's happening just as it is. And so I'm both an observer and a participant, and doing my part to make a difference. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll echo the gratitude to Michael, for kind of curating these conversations. It's been, yeah. I really love the EASIG group and what's happening here. And I mean, I think I can't tie everything together in a neat little bow right now, but I'll say the first, when I met John Renish, the first thing we did together was we went to the Pachamama lunch, and they talked about changing the dream of the Western world, and I was like, oh yeah, that's it. It's big, but that's really the problem. And so I just kept coming back to that. When I heard that, the real problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And the thing I wonder about is, Tom talked about, we need to transform ourselves. And I'm wondering if maybe that's the problem, is maybe it's we need to return to kind of more natural states of harmony. So I'd be really interested in a dialogue around, because I don't know much about it, other than the fact that every time I hear it, it resonates, is, indigenous wisdom, and how do we, I'd have a lot of juice. I would clear my calendar for those dialogues. And then it was, and then I guess I sort of knew it, but didn't have the words for it. But this idea that modernity requires a loss of innerness to work. I mean, because, it's like, I loved Aftab. You kind of called it. It's like, yeah, it is a certain privilege where, the folks in this room are not worried about $6 gas. Doesn't really impact any of us. I got a Tesla, so it really doesn't impact me. But the guy who's like, yeah, saving the planet would be cute, but I can't feed my kids because gas is $6. They're not here. And they can't be here. Can't afford to be here. And what do you do with that? That feels really big. So yeah, so I guess I leave here just as confused as I came, and hopeful, and just eager for more of these conversations, and questioning, how do I kind of bring this into my work, which I'm getting more clarity around what my work is. So I thank you.
Craig, I'm aware of how close you and John Renesh were. And I'll just say that I got a text message from John just now, so to speak. And he's given his full blessing for us to go through the door that John Montgomery pointed to at the beginning here.
I'll go, I guess. Thank you so much for all this wonderful. This is actually one of my favorite subject. I can stay up all day for this, and I have culture and all that stuff. So many perspectives. Like we can go just perspective itself. We can spend half an hour on listening to the perspective. And my focus is about validation and calibration. How, unless I can measure it, I don't know how to improve it. So, and from my perspective, it's about maximum flexibility with minimum expectations, meaning that when there's a goal, what can we go for the meta goal or meta or meta goal? How do we reduce the expectation to even smaller chunks so that we can have a bigger perspective and all that stuff? So wonderful conversation. I learned a lot today, and looking forward for more. I have a lot to catch up with. Whatever you say here, I have to go to visit the website. I get to do that, and the more I learn, I'll have more questions. Right now, I'm just like keep my mouth shut so I can absorb, and hopefully you add to more my whatever deposit I already have. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sam. I guess I'm the only one left. I want to say at first that, John, there will be a recording. The thought of doing a transcript of these things is pretty interesting, but it really would be a possibility. So we'll have a recording available pretty soon of this thing.
Yeah, and the recordings, there are many online services. SimonSays.ai is really cheap and really fast, and it's surprisingly accurate. So that would be a quick way to go.
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
Actually, we uploaded to the YouTube. The YouTube have transcript done.
Okay. That shows you how technologically I'm behind in. But yeah, I just am fascinated by the idea that they developed these inner development goals on the model of the sustainable development goals. So we had to have these five goals and so on. Then we're going to look at how they come out when there are all kinds of other alternatives that we've been talking about here in terms of individual development, vertical development that would be necessary. And I myself had a course years ago, ran for, it's still running in certain places in the world. I'm not part of that, but it was interesting in the idea that we focused on people doing something about something that was important to them. It could be the environment, the climate crisis, and then they were on a path to discover what their path was. So everybody went through this in a different pace. Really, sort of naturally developed, naturally accounted for developmental asymmetry. And so by the end of this, the goal was to answer two questions: who is myself and what is my work? Capital S, capital work, and it's that kind of thing. But also to develop, to set people on the path wherever they were. And so I'm not saying that this was a great thing or anything like that, but it seems to me that something like that would be a much better approach than having inner development goals, and to achieve the kind of thing that we've all been talking about. And also the idea that what do we need for this? I mean, there are different classes of people as well as different cultures and everything else, but I always mention the Margaret Mead thing: never doubt that a small group of people can change the world. In fact, that's the only way it's happened. So who are the people that need to be developed in this way? And it may be sort of part and parcel of the people who are developing in this way to be the people who are going to make the change. And so I don't know what that implies, but in the end, I'm just really, really grateful, Aftab, and for everybody being here and everything you've done. And in the invitation, there are all the recordings, so we can go back to those. And I think I'll have to look at how many people went back and looked at the different recordings. And I think maybe, John, your session might be a winner in terms of that, because it really, really touched a chord. And so we'll carry on. Thanks.
Michael, I and we are grateful for your spacious heart that is hosting us. Thank you.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure. It really is. This is so great.
So,
are you waving goodbye, Michael? Yeah, okay.
yeah, and after we stop the recording, Michael and Aftab, if you have like just a couple of minutes, I'd like to just chat with the two of you.
Yeah, hold on, everybody, because I want to save the chat. I think I did that. Let's see.
It will be saved as together with the recording as well on the Zoom, Michael, if as a backup plan, in case you worry about it.
It's really interesting how far behind I'm saying it's going to be a big job to do the transcription. They're telling me, so
done.
And now I see I don't really need to save the chat because it'll be saved. So on. I'm a master at making work for myself.
Yeah, and if you have the right Zoom subscription, Zoom does a transcript as well. So
okay. Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. Actually, Claudette, you could hang out too for this conversation. I want to just briefly talk about the Rhenish archives.
Yeah, let's do that. I'll stay too.
Yeah.
Like the moment of silence we had a few moments ago was just a really nice example of just being.
Yeah.
together and how nice it feels. Thank you all.
Yes, thank you. I want to acknowledge the coherence that's here just from our talking and how powerful that is. And I want to also, in acknowledging the power of that and how that feels, to not equate it with the next step, which is how life works. Simply the next step, if that doesn't. So, but meanwhile, I'm just completely immersed in the moment. Thank you.
Meanwhile.
All right. Well, Peter, John, enjoy your conversation. Peter, we'll get together for a live in-person coffee.
Love it. Love it. Thank you.
I'm really enjoying like seeing people in person again.
Awesome.
Yeah, that's really, really important. We need to, one of the things that Aftab said in the course of our talking is that organizations like this have to be based on friendship. And I believe that we've lost something by not being able to get together. And so when we're all in the Bay Area, we ought to have more meetings like this, in person.
Yeah.
All hosts, I've got, I love, I've got, of course, parking's a pain in the butt, but.
Yeah, and we've got the recent uptick in COVID going on.
Yeah, I know.
I just this morning had a meeting canceled because somebody tested positive, and I'm wondering about my recent flagrant violation of mask wearing.
You might want to stop the recording now that we're kind of just descending into chit chat.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, but how can I do that?
Just hit stop recording.
Where is that? At the bottom, huh?
If you're the host, you should see it kind of somewhere up.
Sign off.
Bye, John.
Thanks, everyone.
Happy holidays.
Okay.
Yeah.
Happy holidays.
Oh, here
Bye.
I got
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.